Broadcasting live from the School of Athens. This is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everybody's favorite AP World History Review service. Today we are going to continue our discussion of the College Board's Period 3, the post-classical era, which covers the years 600 CE to 1450 CE. So we're going to go ahead and kick it off with key concept 3.2, which says state formation and development demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity in various regions. Now I want you to take careful note of this key concept, as it is one that you might see down the road at a given point in any AP World History course. So go ahead and pause me and put it into your own words and start me up again when you're done. Go ahead. Okay, I put this into my own words by saying that new empires and other entities emerged and had similarities and differences within their own respective geographic positions. So there's going to be some new empires, and they're going to have similarities and differences wherever they're located. Okay, so key concept 3.2 Roman numeral 1 says empires collapsed in different regions of the world and in some areas were replaced by new imperial states or political systems. So let's go ahead and talk about what empires collapsed and what new ones emerged. So Rome is replaced by the Byzantine Empire, which is pictured here. You'll note, or you'll remember that and the Emperor Diocletian splits the Roman Empire in half into a western half and an eastern half to make it easier to administer. And over time, the eastern half becomes more wealthy and more stable, and therefore is able to last for a longer time. So when the western half falls in 476 CE, the eastern half continues on, and even though we call them Byzantines, they called themselves Romans, and so it's kind of a continuation of the Roman Empire. Anyways, you would benefit by considering it a new entity, the Byzantines. And if you recall, their most famous emperor was Justinian, who put in place a law code and had a very famous wife. And they controlled Constantinople, which was the crown jewel of all cities in Europe at the time. In addition to the Byzantines, you see that Persia is replaced by the Islamic Empire, or the Islamic world, Dar al-Islam, shown there on the map. And you'll see that Islam covered a vast amount of Afro-Eurasia and spread very, very quickly. Islam was talked about in the video for Key Concept 3.1, so if you need to, you can always revisit that. The Han Dynasty in China was replaced after a long warring states period that saw a lot of death by the Sui, Tang, and Song. So if you see that map right there, the Sui is noted by the green, the Tang is the red outline, which the jut out into the Taklamakan Desert and along what was the Silk Road, and the Song Dynasty, which shrinks a little bit but becomes easier to manage, is outlined in blue. The Tang and Song dynasties oversaw what was really a golden age in Chinese history. The Gupta dynasty of India was replaced mostly by fragmentation, but there is the emergence of one centralized government at the time, the Delhi Sultanate, which was an Islamic empire in India. Even though Hinduism was still a prevailing religion, the rulers of the Delhi Sultanate were Islamic. And then you see the Maya and the Moche civilizations replaced by the Aztec and the Incas, pictured there. Don't let the sizes of these empires fool you. They were certainly powerful and certainly influential throughout world history. Okay, so now let's talk about how new states utilize traditional power mechanisms. These are themes that are running throughout world history. They come up time and time again, and you'll see them time and time again. First of all, one being the patriarchy, which is seen, I think, most clearly through Confucianist ideals in China. You see the marginalization of women through traditions like foot binding, which obviously the jury is out on whether or not that was a way to marginalize women or a way to exalt their status, but we're not going to debate that here. But patriarchy tends to carry the day. You see religion used as a power mechanism in various places. The Byzantines adopt Christianity. They turn it into their own Eastern Orthodox Christianity, their own version of Christianity. It's not the same as Roman Catholicism, which was practiced in the West, but still Christianity is an ongoing force in the area. Then you also see the Mongols, a new and emerging civilization that will be discussed more later, convert to Islam. during the time period. And then you also see landowning elites who have a lot of power and wield that power through economic and physical exertion in Western Europe and also in Eastern Europe. You see this with the Byzantines who start to engage in dynastic marriages in order to keep the royal family on the throne. Okay, these new states that we're talking about utilize innovations to facilitate their growth in addition to those traditional power mechanisms. So, new ways of growth, and just bear in mind that this is not a full list of these things. We're not listing this to exhaustion. These are just suggestions. If there are things here that pique your curiosity or interest, I encourage you to go back and take a look at whatever notes you have for your AP World class to clear it up. So methods of taxation are new ways that states facilitate growth. The best example of this is the jizya that's implemented throughout the Islamic world to non-Muslims within the Islamic Empire. You see the emergence of tributary systems in the Americas and most notably in China, which is where the empire in question demands and exerts tribute from surrounding areas. Now, in terms of the Aztecs, they took tribute in the forms of these things right here. This is a tribute ledger from the Aztecs, so you can see jaguar pelts and feathers and other resources that they utilize heavily. In Tang China, not only did they demand tribute in the form of money, but they also demanded tribute in the form of respect, which is where the practice of kowtow or the bowing of nomads to the Chinese bureaucrats and nobles and emperor came into play. You also see these new states adopt religious institutions. So the Tang Dynasty in China adopts Neo-Confucianism, which is a blending of Buddhism and Confucianism. Buddhism had made inroads during the Han Dynasty and during the subsequent Warring States period. Now, even though the Tang Dynasty was rather tolerant towards towards Buddhism at the beginning of its reign, it became more intolerant of it and actually persecuted it towards the end of its reign because they felt that Buddhism was becoming threatening. Nevertheless, you see these new states um, figure out new ways to facilitate their growth. Now, these states that, in addition to the states I already discussed, you see the emergence of new political entities that we had never seen before. So, the best example of this is the Mongols. We don't have a lot of time to get into the Mongols in too much depth right now, but just note that in addition to Islam, they are the driving force behind this post-classical era towards the latter end of it. So the Mongol Empire starts when Genghis Khan unifies the Mongolian tribes and very quickly takes over most of Afro-Eurasia using horses. They're very skilled archers, and their ability to terrorize their opponents and take over cities very quickly and brutally allowed them to conquer a lot of land, more land than the Romans conquered in 400 years. The Mongols were able to conquer in just 40. Now, don't think that the Mongols were just barbarians. They were actually very good at adapting to their surroundings, which we mentioned before that they converted to Islam. But then they also settled down in places like Baghdad and in near Russia and what is the modern day Uzbekistan. So you see the Mongols take on agriculture even. Though they had started out as nomads, they eventually settle down and take on agriculture. So they are very adaptable and they take on a lot of the characteristics of the places around them. We also see the new political entity of feudalism emerge, most notably in Japan and Europe. Feudalism is a system that is characterized by relationships. So in Europe, you have a king who has a lot of land at his disposal. He trades land to a noble in exchange for allegiance. The noble then trades some of his land to a knight in exchange for protection, and the knight exchanges protection for work and payment with a peasant or a serf. The feudalism works the same way in Japan. It's just a little bit different in that knights held a higher status and peasants held a higher status than merchants did in the Japanese feudal structure. And also, the emperor was more of a figurehead, whereas the king in Europe, the top of either feudal structure, had a little bit more power than that emperor did. In addition to feudalism, you also see the emergence of city-states. So these are both decentralized forms of political organization. City-states emerge in Venice, which will also be the topic of more talk in the next historical period. But for this historical period, here's an outlier to mention. Great Zimbabwe, which of course is on the southeastern coast of Africa, emerges because of its involvement in Indian Ocean trade. Now, these states combined local and foreign traditions, as we just said with the Mongols who converted to Islam. Other places do the same thing. So, China, this is best seen in the case of China. So, China exerts its influence very heavily, but also very sporadically throughout East Asia. It influenced Japan largely because Japan willingly took on a lot of Chinese characteristics. For example, Confucianism, a centralized government, a bureaucracy. Japan tinkers and toys with all of these ideas around the 600s. And then during the Heian period of China, they start to turn all of this back around, or I'm sorry, the Heian period of Japan, they start to turn all of this back around and shun a lot of Chinese influence. Now, they keep their writing system and they do keep some elements of Confucianism and they do keep some elements of Buddhism. However, in all three of these cases, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, they develop with some Chinese influence, but mostly independently. In the form of Korea, they take on Chinese writing, however, very quickly develop a different type of bureaucratic system. For example, in Korea, not everyone was allowed to take a civil service exam, only wealthy patrons were, so you ended up getting a government bureaucracy that was not made up of representation of the population. And then you get Vietnam, who just really likes to be autonomous, and China sort of forces their will upon the Vietnamese. And eventually, the Vietnamese are going to stay persistent and get their independence from China. You also see this combined local and foreign traditions in the Kievan Rus, which is a Viking settlement in what is modern day Ukraine when they adopt to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So these new states are combining both some things that they do and foreign influence as well. Moving on to key concept 3.2, Roman numeral 2 states interregional contacts and conflicts between states and empires encourage significant technological and cultural transfers. So, the established states that we've discussed engage in technological and cultural transfers, which shouldn't be surprising considering this unit is mostly about interaction between these new states. So, one that we haven't mentioned yet, an example of exchange through interaction, is the Crusades. The Crusades were a holy war. Some would argue not a holy war, but, anyways, the Pope calls upon Christians in Europe to go regain the Holy Land, and it leads to enduring battles between Christians and Muslims. Now, during these battles, Christians who had traveled to the Muslim Empire bring back to Europe things that Europe had not had access to in a long time. For example, spices, which brought about a more vibrant European cuisine. Also, knowledge, particularly Greek and Roman classics that the Muslims had been studying for years, that the Romans had or the Europeans had kind of forgotten about, make their way back into Europe as a result of the Crusades. And additionally, the Europeans get access to scientific and medical knowledge that the Arabs had been practicing during their golden ages under the Umayyad and the Abbasid caliphates. Now, the Islamic scientific knowledge also is passed on to the Mongols, who had very little exposure to these kinds of things before, considering their pastoral nomadic roots. Also, you see Chinese innovations move along the Silk Road, like paper and gunpowder. And another example of a cultural transfer is the movement of Islam into West Africa via the trans-Saharan trade routes. Obviously, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai are three enduring West African empires that rise during this time period. The most famous of which is Mali, which was incredibly wealthy because of all of the gold that is said to flow freely in the rivers of the area, which led to the incredibly wealthy king Mansa Musa, who makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, which shows not only his wealth, but his willingness to interact and his devout Muslim faith because he's willing to make that pilgrimage. All right, that's going to bring key concept 3.2 to an end. So this is your Buddha signing off.